Have you ever wondered why some young children seem to learn a second language effortlessly, almost like sponges, while others just struggle for years despite hours of formal instruction? What if I told you the secret isn't more vocabulary lists or grammar drills, but rather skipping them altogether? Hello, everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a massive paradigm shift in the world of linguistics. We're talking about Stephen Krashen's theory of second language acquisition. We're going to look closely at how this groundbreaking framework proves that children actually develop language best, not through rigid memorization, but naturally, through meaningful communication. Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to start by comparing acquisition versus learning, then we'll map out the natural order and explore the monitor hypothesis. After that, we'll look at the magic ingredients, input and the effective filter, before jumping into free voluntary reading. And finally, we'll wrap up with some critiques and real-world classroom implications. All right. Let's jump right into Section 1, Acquisition versus Learning. So let's dive into this, because it's the absolute cornerstone of Krashen's entire philosophy. He argues that there are two totally independent ways we develop language. First up, we have acquisition. This is subconscious. It's implicit. Think about how babies learn their very first language. Nobody's giving them grammar drills or vocab tests, right? They simply pick it up through natural communication. On the flip side, we have learning. Now, learning is conscious and explicit. It's the formal knowledge of a language, like sitting in a classroom and memorizing rules. But here's the kicker. For young children, acquisition isn't just preferred, it's literally the natural and frankly far more powerful way to develop language. To really prove that teaching formal rules isn't what drives early language development, let's look at some fascinating research by Brown and his colleagues. When they studied how parents actually interact with their kids, they found something incredible. Parents almost never correct grammar. Instead, they correct the truth value of what the child is saying. So, for example, if a little kid says, "her curl my hair," the parent usually just accepts it without turning it into a grammar lesson because the meaning is perfectly clear. But if a child says, "Walt Disney is on Tuesday," well, the parent is going to immediately correct them, not on the grammar, but on the fact that the show is actually on Wednesday. The big takeaway here, natural child language acquisition thrives on meaningful interaction, not on constant error correction. So if kids are just acquiring language naturally without formal rules, is it just total chaos? Actually, no. And that brings us to Section 2, the natural order. And this brilliantly illustrates how children follow a highly predictable developmental path when acquiring English. Notice how grammatical structures definitely aren't acquired at random. Things like the progressive ing, like he is playing, and the plural s, well, they tend to appear very early on. Meanwhile, the irregular past tense is acquired much, much later. It's a progression. A child might first say, "me want juice," then, "I want juice," and eventually, "I want some juice, please." As educators, we literally cannot force a child to master complex grammar before they are developmentally ready for it. They are essentially following their own internal syllabus. Which naturally leads us to a pretty important question. If acquisition is doing all the heavy lifting, what exactly is the point of conscious learning? Let's move on to Section 3, the monitor hypothesis. In Krashen's model, our subconscious acquired competence is what actually initiates our speech. It's the engine responsible for our fluency. The formal rules that we consciously learned, well, they really only have one very limited job. They act strictly as a monitor, basically an internal editor. After our brain generates a sentence intuitively, the learned system quickly scans it to make little corrections right before we speak it out loud. But here is the catch. To actually use this mental monitor, you need to meet 3 strict prerequisites. You have to have sufficient time to think about the rule, you have to be actively focused on correctness, and, obviously, you actually have to know the rule in the first place. Now, picture a group of 4-year-olds playing in a sandbox. When a kid excitedly yells, "I good outside," do you think they're consulting a mental grammar book? Absolutely not. Rapid, everyday conversation leaves 0 time for the monitor. This is exactly why young children rely almost entirely on spontaneous acquisition, and why it's so important that we don't interrupt them to correct their grammar in the heat of the moment. Now that we know acquisition is the absolute key, how do we actually trigger it? Let's check out Section 4, Input and Effective Filter. The real catalyst for all of this is something Krashen calls comprehensible input. You'll often see this represented by the formula I+1. So imagine I is a child's current level of language. For them to progress, they need to be exposed to language that is I+1, just one tiny step beyond what they already know. The sweet spot here is that the overall message must still be completely understood, even if they don't know every single word. This happens completely naturally when we use visual cues, gestures, or context. Think of a teacher saying, "Let's wash our hands," while actually demonstrating it. The child understands the action way before mastering the vocabulary. It is the essential ingredient for language growth, and it requires absolutely zero formal instruction. But let's pause here for a second and think about this. Have you ever been in a situation where someone is explaining something super clearly, the input is perfect, you understand the words, but you still just can't seem to absorb the language? What invisible barrier might be stopping a learner right in their tracks? Well, that invisible barrier is what Krashen calls the affective filter. You see, our emotions play a massive role in our ability to acquire language. There are three main factors at play here: motivation, self-confidence, and anxiety. If a child is highly anxious, lacks confidence, or just isn't motivated, their affective filter goes up. And when that filter is high, it literally acts as a subconscious wall. It screens out all that amazing comprehensible input and totally blocks it from ever reaching the brain's language acquisition device. So, a student could be receiving the absolute best I+1 input in the world, but if they are terrified of making a mistake in front of the class, there is no way they are going to acquire the language. So, how do we provide massive amounts of comprehensible input in a low anxiety way? That brings us to Section 5, free voluntary reading. Free voluntary reading, or FVR, is exactly what it sounds like. It's reading simply because you want to. In this model, there are no book reports, no end-of-chapter comprehension questions, and crucially, there is absolutely no forced completion. If a child doesn't like a book, they just put it down and pick up another one. Krashen strongly argues that FVR is the missing ingredient in language arts, simply because it provides the ultimate low-anxiety, highly comprehensible input. Now, what's really interesting about the data here is the trend that emerges when we compare free voluntary reading to traditional grammar instruction. In short-term studies, we're talking less than 7 months, traditional methods sometimes actually show a slight edge. But look at the long-term results. When implemented for greater than 1 year, FVR produced strictly better results in 8 out of 10 studies with 0 negative results, meaning, given enough time, simply letting kids read what they love consistently beats out traditional instruction. But as focused learners, we always want to look at the full picture, right? Let's head into our final section, Section 6, Critiques and Classroom Implications. While Krashen's framework is immensely popular, it really revolutionized language teaching, it's definitely not without some academic pushback. Scholars like McLaughlin have pointed out that some of Krashen's core concepts, particularly the really strict boundary he draws between conscious and subconscious learning, well, they're a bit vague and lack rigorous empirical scrutiny. Critics argue the theory is sometimes just too metaphorical to be tested definitively in a lab setting. However, we really shouldn't view this as a reason to just toss the theory out. This is simply part of the natural scientific process, carving out intellectual space so we can refine and better understand how the human brain actually works. So the crucial point is this. Regardless of the academic debates over exact terminology, the practical, everyday implications of Krashen's theory are incredibly clear and deeply effective for early childhood education. As educators, or even as parents, our main task is not to be the grammar police. Our job is to provide abundant, meaningful, comprehensible input. We need to center our time on actual communication, on play, and on interaction, rather than isolating language forms. We absolutely must protect our students' emotional preparedness by fostering a low-anxiety, highly supportive environment where making mistakes is completely fine. And finally, we should be filling our rooms with books and encouraging free voluntary reading so that vocabulary and grammar can just grow organically. And that brings us to the end of our explainer today. But before we go, I want to leave you with a provocative thought to reflect on. Knowing the undeniable power of natural acquisition, how will you transform your own classroom, or even your own home, to prioritize meaningful communication over rote memorization? How can you lower that affective filter today? Thank you so much for joining me. Keep learning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.